Hello, folks. Welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is Death Interrupted, the Draugr. Ooh, I should have saved this one for Halloween. All right, so our key questions for today. What were the Draugr, and why were they so easily adopted and incorporated into game mechanics? So we're going to begin by talking about who the Draugr were within Scandinavian culture, and then to see how a couple of our case studies used them within their game worlds. All right, so the undead in Scandinavia, they are not disembodied spirits. They are not ghosts, as we might think of them. They do, however, have perhaps a little bit too much personality to be seen as zombies. Draugr are what results when the ritual process has been interrupted in some way. And by this I mean that if a dead man or woman is not properly buried, he or she can become an again walker, which is the translation of another synonym for Draugr. It is not uncommon for the Draugr to have been unpleasant people in life. So there is some suggestion that, if you're a jerk in real life, you're more likely to be the walking dead after you're gone. If you are antisocial, if you are cruel to those around you, your chances of meeting this end are higher, possibly because people do not grieve for you when you die, right? Now, in some sagas, dead warriors are buried with their horse, their hound, and their hawk. And if they do become a Draugr, they wind up eating their loyal animal companions. Yeah. Now, the dead don't always walk in Scandinavia. In fact, it is actually in Iceland where they seem to do that more often. Elsewhere, they tend to just haunt their burial mound. But when they do walk out of their barrow, when they become barrow walkers, oftentimes they're accompanied by a mist or some form of temporary darkness. Now, conversely, if you are a mortal man who chooses to enter a burial mound or a barrow, you rarely come out again. Those who try are often those who are trying to pillage the grave for its treasure. I'll give you an example from Skyrim, actually. If you're traveling with Belrand as a follower and go down into the barrow, he'll basically say, hey, we'll find some gold here, but leave some for the dead out of respect. So even in a fantasy version of medieval Scandinavia, the Draugr is recognized as the guardian of its barrow. Now, in folklore, if the Draugr is not walking abroad, it's easier to deal with. If you're going to get rid of a Draugr within its barrow, you can cut its head off, put the head between the Draugr's feet, or behind it with the face against the buttocks. This confuses the Draugr, who won't rise as a result. Don't ask. It has something to do with your buttocks being the face you turn to the devil, or something similar, we think. These types of Draugr are not really a threat to the living. Draugr are usually only a threat to living beings when they walk abroad. When they do that, they do tend to attack people or animals. They sometimes tear them limb from limb. Sometimes their human victims can become Draugr themselves. Sometimes they just terrorize the living, as you see in Grettir's fight with Glam from the reading that you were given to go along with this lecture. So how do you deal with the most dangerous type of Draugr? Well, the answer is usually to bury someone along with them, so a wife or a slave as substitute. Sometimes this can just be ritual. There's a story about a dead hero, Helgi, whose Valkyrie lover comes to lie with him and spend one last night in his arms, and this quiets his spirit. He stops walking abroad. Now, you can also choose to burn the body, but this can have some negative consequences, according to folklore. In one case, a particularly nasty Draugr is burned, but the ashes are licked up by a pregnant cow. The calf she gives birth to is very large, grows into a violent bull who attacks the farmer and then runs off into the mountains. In another saga, the ashes are sealed in a lead casket, which is dropped into a hot spring. There's clearly some sense that further spiritual contamination could in fact happen. Now, I'm going to give you a few interesting stories about Draugr because I love telling them, and they're just fun. So, for instance, there was a Christian woman by the name of Thorgunna who ordered in her will that she'd be buried in a Christian churchyard. The closest one was 2 days away from where she died. Her funeral party took her body and started the journey. They asked for hospitality from a farmer that first night, and although he gave them a place to stay, he refused to give them food. This is a breach in hospitality. So in the middle of the night, the farmer's family heard noise from their larder. They got up to find the dead woman stark naked cooking a meal for her funeral party. Apparently after that they were very hospitable. Now, we also have stories that talk about battles with Draugr who dwell within the mounds. Sodi and Ragnar are Vikings who apparently guarded a great treasure in their burial mounds. The hero of one saga, Horthr, vows to break open Sodi's grave mound, not to take the treasure, but just to be daring. Supposedly it's a heroic deed to bait a Draugr. Now, it doesn't go well. 2 of his men die immediately from the stink from the mound. To explain this quickly, in the medieval period, there was something called miasma theory, which I actually think dates back to the classical period. The idea that illnesses and death were sometimes caused by really bad smells. The hero attacks Soti, who's in his burial ship, and defeats him using candlelight. But Soti actually curses a ring that Horthr takes from him. Now, Ragnar, meanwhile, had himself buried alive in order to guard his treasure. So he's neither alive nor dead. His ritual process is all screwed up. Gestur Bartharsson is the hero of this saga. He fights Ragnar. He invokes the name of Olaf Tryggvason, the first Christian king of Norway, to rob the ghost of his strength. And he puts his head by his buttocks to expel him permanently. Now, by the way, there are a number of warrior types who bury themselves alive. There's another saga who mentions Thrain the Berserker, who shut himself up in a barrel once he became too old to fight. Consider this a solution of the Scandinavian old school. You give yourself to Odin rather than dying in bed. This may actually have been a form of ritual euthanasia. Now, in another minor saga, a Jarl, Agfi, buries himself alive with his treasure, but is later found walking abroad. The hero of the saga, Thorstein, who is a Christian, robs his barrel of 2 horns while he's out of it, then waits until he goes back in to put a cross on the door, and that quiets the Draugr. So obviously folklore is changing a fair bit in the Christian period as you start to see these elements added. Much more famously from the Laxdæla saga, Viga Hrapr. He is buried by the hero Höskuldur and moved to a remote area, which causes his undead activities to decrease. But Rapr's son goes crazy and abandons his farm because his father's still haunting him. Now, the next man to farm there, Olaf, has other problems. One of his workmen won't go into the cowshed because anytime he tries, he sees Rapper standing in the door trying to claw at him. Olaf has to go looking for Rapper's cairn, and when he finds this out, when he discovers the cairn, he finds that Rapper is not rotten, so he has not rotted away. And therefore he burns him, and only then does Rapper disappear from the story. Now, Rapper had been one of those really unpleasant types before his death. He had been very aggressive towards his neighbors, and of course it just gets worse after he dies. So death seems to bring out the bad parts of your personality if you're a nasty person already. Or, in the case of Thorgunna, the good parts of your personality come out. She's just trying to feed her funeral party. The farmer was a jerk. Anyway, the undead in Scandinavian folklore are very often not always evil, but marginal people in life, too. So, what about the games? Okay, so the Draugr in Skyrim have really lost the individuality that Scandinavian Draugr had. They're not totally zombified, but they really only pay lip service to their mythological origins. They're XP fodder, basically. They are one of the most common enemies that you'll face in Skyrim. You find them in barrows and catacombs. Very rarely the world above. I think the only exceptions are some of the really high-level Draugr who will sometimes emerge from tombs. They are undead Nordic warriors who served, or in some cases were, dragon priests in Skyrim's ancient period. Now, they are portrayed similarly in some ways to the way zombies are portrayed in other video games, in that they have this hierarchical system that identifies their threat level with various stereotypical clues. Many of them use weapons. Higher level Draugr can use magic, including dragon shouts. There's a whole leveled system for Draugr. So you have the regular Draugr, you have the restless Draugr, the Draugr White, the Draugr Scourge, that's the level where they start using magic, the Draugr Overlord, the Draugr Deathlord, that's the one in the image there, and the Draugr Death Overlord. So they and their weapons and their magic increase in strength as you move up the scale. And honestly, even with the primitive 2011 graphics, I still find them creepy because they hiss at you in the dragon tongue when they attack. And if you look up the translations of their hissing online, they say things like bow before the dead, or break and bleed, or pain, shame, death. And I mean, you are not always sure when you're moving through a barrow which of the corpses and coffins are going to get up and come at you. So it's mildly creepy when you first start playing the game and exploring barrows. Now, I mentioned they were also different than your regular video game zombie, so I should explain. They don't tend to swarm you, which is a hallmark of ordinary zombies. They often retreat if they're injured instead of just being driven forward by instinct. They're not after your brains. They want to kill you, but there's a little strategy left in them. So this is a little bit more true to the original idea of the Draugr, who was an individual, just one who had slipped outside the normal cycle of life. You don't communicate with most of them. Again, the only exceptions are a couple of the high-level ones. We'll try and speak to you if I remember correctly. But they are, as I said, they're XP fodder. They're low-level baddies in a lot of cases. They're still pretty scary. I'm sorry. I was playing a bit of Skyrim the other day, and I'm like, oh, this is still creepy. Sneaking around barrows, and then you hear the grinding noise as they move. There is a reason that Skyrim has been so popular for so long. All right, so the other relevant example here is, of course, God of War. So, like in Skyrim, the Draugr of God of War are a specific subset of enemy with sub-subsets that your protagonists can encounter. Now, as can be expected in a more sophisticated game, the classification system and the various traits each kind of Draugr have is more complicated as well. God of War's Draugr range from the common Draugr, and they fight with a single weapon and tend to appear in groups. They're not particularly threatening if they're on their own. Frankly, they're not particularly threatening to Kratos if they're in groups. You have the Draugr Brute, which is a stronger variety. You have Draugr who wield two weapons, and then ones that can cast Fireball or that can stand up to a hit from Kratos. Some also have special abilities. So some of them, if you hit them, their bodies will explode, or they can channel energy through their weapons, or they have superhuman speed. Now, Atreus, in his journal, which serves as the game's codex, reflects on what his mother told him about Draugr. And just as a note, I haven't mentioned this before, but it is really interesting that so many games of this nature sort of call their collection of information their codex. That is a very medieval way to look at it. Anyways, he was told by Faye that the Draugr were dead warriors who were too stubborn to go along with the Valkyries to Valhalla. They would fight them, and the strain of that fight would turn them into things that were not human and, sort of warp their bodies. Now, is this actually the source of the Draugr that Kratos and Atreus fight? It doesn't appear to be. That I'm going to make a hypothesis here. It's never really explained clearly, but that sounds like it was like the ordinary way that you got Draugr in Midgard before all of this happened. The Draugr that Kratos and Atreus begin to encounter come about a different way. On their journey, Kratos and Atreus encounter almost no living humans at all. The only exception is a group of cannibal reavers, and they're encountered early in their journey when they're trying to make their way towards what they think is the peak, where Faye wanted her ashes scattered. The reavers try to kill them for food, but when Kratos kills them instead, they transform and they rise again as Draugr. Now, in one of the pair's early encounters with Freya, where they still think she's just like a woods witch, Atreus mentions these risen dead to her, and she calls them hellwalkers and says that they are, quote, poor restless souls denied their judgment and their peace. This plague of dead is but a symptom of a world out of balance. Someone, something, or someone has meddled with powerful forces. So this is confirmed when Kratos has to journey to Hell in order to bring back the heart of the bridge keeper so that Freya can use it to heal Atreus of his sickness. When they're in Hell, Mimir recognizes what's happening, and he says, "Oh, this is so wrong. Only the newly dead should be here. There's too many. The gate must be closed. And if the gate's closed, then it's true. Hell's full up. Without the Valkyries to sort and cull them, Hell is overwhelmed." So the interesting thing is that you don't actually find out what causes this in the main storyline of the game. What's going on with the Valkyries is part of a side quest. It's actually endgame content, something that you're meant to do after you achieve the end of the main story arc, because it's sort of like the ultimate test of your mastery of the game's combat system. So what you discover is that the Valkyries have somehow been trapped in physical form, and this is something that corrupts them. It leads them unable to lead the souls of the dead to Valhalla. Kratos and Atreus can defeat each of them in turn and free them from this corruption, but the Valkyries, as they're, becoming spirit forms again, are confused. They can't explain what happened, except that somehow their queen, Sigrun, was involved, and they can't understand why she would be involved in such a thing, because they know that if they're not doing their duty, Helheim will overflow and the walking dead will return to Midgard. So when father and son finally find Sigrun, they discover that the magic was worked on her as well, and when they free her, she is able to tell them that this was actually part of Odin's vengeance against Freya, because Freya was the original Valkyrie queen. So when their marriage broke down, he was just trying to destroy everything she cared about, so he attacked the Valkyries. And this is Odin's paranoia and general crappiness working against him again in this universe, because by weakening the Valkyries and leaving them open to corruption, he creates a situation where the natural forces are out of balance. At the very least, he's undermining his own preparations for Valhalla, because if the Valkyries are not there to take the Einherjar to where they can serve as his troops in the final battle, he's weakened Valhalla's defenses. So he wants to stop Ragnarok, yet there he goes again, doing stuff that's going to bring it about faster. Odin's lack of foresight strikes again. Now, we've already mentioned that there's one use of a Draugr in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Eivor has that vision of Hemming Jarl, but that's the only mention of that idea in-game. There is, however, an out-of-game use. I could not find the image, but one of the armor sets you can buy in the game store is the Draugr armor. It's very strange looking. It's presumably for those with a taste in the Gothic. So we have a wide range of different uses of the concept of Draugr amongst our case studies. The reasons for this are obvious, I think. They are parallel to both zombies and ghosts in limited ways, and both of those are archetypes that we're very familiar with as a modern society. There are built-in mechanics associated with them. Again, this interruption of the ritual process. So they work very well as examples of something that's gone wrong with the world. So they can be evidence of a serious problem that the hero has to find a way to solve, as well as, something for them to stab. And you can't get much better when you're looking for video game enemies, right? All right, so that'll do it for this week, guys. Thanks very much, and I will see you at the Zoom session.